This is episode 323 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Join us today at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Tammy Dupuis, the owner-operator of the Renaissance Taylor website. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
We were behind Europe by maybe 50 or more years. It was common to be using Indo-Arabic numerals in the mid-1500s on the continent, but in England, still Roman numerals. Shakespeare was the first generation who would have been learning this new Indo-Arabic numeral system.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Throughout his works, Shakespeare references math terminology that goes well beyond the arithmetic education we expect him to have received at grammar school. There's history behind the references that shares not only where Shakespeare would have learned about higher mathematics, but Shakespeare's choices for specific math terms reflect major changes in England for the numerals that were being used to record data, as well as official acts of parliament that were being passed to define and standardize lengths and measures for the very first time. Here today to share with us some of the history behind a few of Shakespeare's mathematical terms is our guest and author of the book Much Ado About Numbers, Rob Eastaway. Rob Eastaway is an author and presenter who specializes in the mathematics of everyday life. In 2017, he was awarded the prestigious Zeeman Medal for his work in communicating maths to the general public. His many books about everyday maths include the best-selling Why Do Buses Come in Threes?, Maths on the Back of an Envelope, and How Many Socks Make a Pair? He regularly appears on BBC Radio and has given talks on maths to audience of all ages across the world. Hello, Rob. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, I'm delighted to be on here.
In his book, Much Ado About Numbers, Rob writes that Robert Greene, who is famous for calling Shakespeare an upstart crow, also called Shakespeare a Johannes factotum. Rob, explain for us what this phrase means and how is that commentary on Shakespeare's knowledge of math?
Johannes factotum, what that means literally is John factotum does everything. So it's describing someone who can do everything, which sounds like a compliment, but actually it's being said, I think, sarcastically. And it's the modern term, a precursor to the modern term, jack of all trades, to which the follow-on is classically master of none. You think you could do a bit of everything, but not much. Now, I think that what Robert Greene is really concerned with here is Shakespeare's role as both an actor and then as a playwright. So he can do two things, and you're not supposed to do two things. I don't think he's probably referring to much beyond that. But in a wider sense, there is a sign that Shakespeare was a bit of a guy who could do lots of things. He was certainly interested in lots of things. So interested in literature, clearly, and classical learning, in geography, history, astronomy, really interested in music. His plays are full of music. Maybe science, not so sure on that, but games and arithmetic. So he was a bit of an interested in everything. Whether he was a jack of all trades, I don't know. What we can say is he was probably not formally educated in mathematics. I doubt Robert Greene is referring to maths, and Shakespeare would have left school at 14. He might have done a little bit of arithmetic, but to study what we regard as mathematics today, you'd had to go to university, and that's where you would learn formally about the maths of music, geometry, astronomy, and arithmetic at university. I mean, it's bizarre. So Shakespeare, his education at grammar school would have touched on basic number, and all the other mathematics that he learned would have been picked up in life through reading about the study and research that was going on, and then everyday life, measurement and accounting and so on. He all his knowledge of how money worked is just picked up through life, really.
In his plays, Shakespeare uses the word score several times, including in Othello when Bianca uses the phrase 8 score 8 to tell us how many hours are in a week. Rob, share with us exactly how many hours are in a week, because I don't think any of us calculate that on a regular day-to-day basis. And what is the history behind the idea of a score?
Well, let's start with score, the word, first of all. It's an Old Norse word, written originally, we'd write it S-K-O-R, and it sort of means a notch or a scratch. And we still actually use the word score to, when you scratch a line in something, you score it. So that was the original meaning. And this notching was used to count. And you can imagine maybe wanted to count sheep. You just put a notch in for every sheep. And over the centuries, it became associated with batches of 20. So perhaps because we got 10 fingers and 10 toes, we can count to 20, and that's represented with these notches. So a score became 20. And perhaps the most famous example of score, not in Shakespeare, is in the King James Bible and other Bibles since, which talk about 70 as being 70. So the notion of 20 is, and as part of counting system, is in other cultures as well. And in French to this day, they still count 80 as being 80, 4 20s. So scores have been around for a long time. And Shakespeare loved the word score. He liked using 3 score and 4 score much more than using 60 or 80. So bear that in mind. When he has got Bianca saying to Cassio, you've been away for a week, you've been away for 7 days, he then wants to sort of ram it home by saying how many hours that is. And you asked the great question, how many hours are there in a week? Well, I wouldn't have known that. I have to work it out. It's 24 times 7, which is 168. So does Shakespeare say 168? Oh, no, he's much more poetic in the way he says it. So he's converted that into 8 score 8. Lovely, 8 score 8. 8 times 20 is 160 plus 8. So to me, that's an example of Shakespeare doing the math, as they say, and then turning it into poetry, which is really elegant and a sign of just how numerate he was.
It's a lot of work, really, for something to sound pretty in that technical way of like, why would you want to have this information? So there's a lot of artistry in the word. I mean, it's the same level of detail you would put into a painting, but you've put it into a phrase instead.
I agree. And I think there's just so many signs throughout his work of Shakespeare playing with numbers, not just saying the straight number, but saying instead of 50, half 100. Just how lovely, that he's clearly confident with numbers and likes to express them in different ways.
The math that we learn today in school, specifically algebra, is based on Arabic numerals. And in his book, Rob writes that, quote, the use of Arabic numerals in continental Europe was decades ahead of England, end quote. Rob, what number system were Shakespeare and his contemporaries in England actually using?
So let's remind ourselves what the Arabic numeral system is, or Indo-Arabic to give it a fuller name. So these days we're just used to writing numbers, of course, with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and making numbers out of those 10 digits. But that idea originated in India, moved to the Arabic world and moved into Europe through trade as a far more efficient way of writing numbers than the system that had been used for centuries, which was Roman numerals. That's what Europe had been using to write numbers with. So Shakespeare's father, I found out through my research, was basically the final generation in England to use Roman numerals. We were behind Europe by maybe 50 or more years. It was common to be using Indo-Arabic numerals in the mid-1500s on the continent, but in England, still Roman numerals. Shakespeare was the first generation who would have been learning this new Indo-Arabic numeral system. So what number system was being used in the late 1500s, early 1600s? Well, actually both. You see people writing like Henslow writing his diary, and sometimes writing with Indo-Arabic numerals and sometimes Roman, depending on what day of the week it was. It's really charming, the fact that clearly here we had a society that was getting to grips with this innovation, this new way of writing numbers that was unfamiliar. And many other people weren't writing numbers at all. They were still using counters. They were still using like a kind of abacus, a form of abacus to add up numbers quicker and more efficient and so on. So representing numbers with counters rather than writing numbers as we would today.
If Shakespeare was familiar with the modern digits that we use, 0 through 9, why does he never use the word zero anywhere in his works?
Good question. First of all, because the word zero hadn't arrived yet. It was a French word, zéro, and it doesn't really appear in England until the early mid 1600s. So Shakespeare had to use the word that was around instead. And the introduction of Indo-Arabic numerals into England really was accelerated by a guy called Robert Record, who wrote a book about arithmetic. Here's how this new arithmetic with these new numerals works. He wrote it in a book called The Ground of Arts. And one of the things he's introducing to the population is, here's what these new numerals look like. And there's a lovely little table showing a countdown. 9 looks like this, a squirrely circle with a line down. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then what we would recognize as a 0, Robert Record puts the word that was in use, which is cipher. Now, today we think of cipher as a code, but then it was sort of like a code. It's a mystery symbol that represents nothing and yet is very powerful because it means you can suddenly be far more efficient with your digits. And a 1 followed by a cipher is 10, which is great, rather than the old Roman X. And cipher is the word that Shakespeare uses for 0. He uses it a few times. And my favorite example of where he uses it is in the opening of Henry V, where the chorus comes on and, to simplify things a little bit, basically says, we're about to recreate the Battle of Agincourt. And that had loads of soldiers and we've only got, let's say, 7 actors on the stage. You, the audience, you're going to have to use your imagination and picture us representing this massive army. So tell you what, I will be the 1 at the beginning of the number, a crooked figure, because the digit 1 was written very crookedly at that time. And my fellow actors will be the ciphers. And that way, 1 becomes a million just by having 1 followed by 6 zeros. So it's like this lovely notion of, let's imagine huge numbers by using this fabulous new tool that turns 1 into a million with 6 little squiggles. So really, that's what's going on. And that's why Shakespeare, I think, was really excited by this new invention, as it was regarded, of a cipher, a nothing to represent very big numbers.
I think there's a metaphor there, or a representation with the globe and the concept of the theater, and lots to explore there about what the concept of 0 being nothing that contains a whole bunch might have meant for Shakespeare.
Yes, and in that same speech, they refer to the Globe Theatre and this, I forget the exact phrase, but this giant O. The O was the Globe Theatre, which was a circle. And so there's also this notion that this new cipher figure is also a letter of the alphabet. So there's all these connections. I mean, Shakespeare's playing with words and finding connections in just the way that he does. So numbers, letters, it's all connected.
One phrase that comes up regularly for anyone studying England for any amount of time is the quote, to be at 6s and 7s. And Shakespeare even uses a similar expression of at 6 and 7 in his play Richard II. Rob, for those of us that are not familiar with this phrase natively, because I know it's not something that I use or have heard on this side of the pond, explain, what does it mean to be at 6s and 7s? And is Shakespeare using that same meaning when it comes up in Richard II?
Wow, yes. So there's a lot in there. And actually, people might be familiar with the phrase 6s and 7s from a song. Is it Don't Cry for Me, Argentina by Tim Rice? And in that song, at 6s and 7s with me, I think so. But it means to be all over the place, to be confused, to be in disarray. So it is a phrase that's sometimes still used in England. And where does it come from? Well, we're not certain, but perhaps it relates to a dice game that was really popular in Tudor England called Hazard. Shakespeare refers to Hazard, this dice game, and the idea of the game, it came in a number of versions. One version popular on the continent of Europe was with 3 dice. I think in England it was more popular to play it with 2 dice. But either way, the idea very simply was to bet what total would come up on the dice when you rolled them. So if it was a 3 dice version, then the lowest score you could get would be 3 ones, which is 3, and the highest score is 18. But of course, it's going to be probably somewhere in the middle of those. In fact, the most likely scores will be 9, 10, 11, 12, as it turns out. So I think there's an original reference to 6s and 7s that's related to the hazard game that's more about taking a risk or doing something stupid or whatever, because 6 and 7 are not very likely. So if you bet on those, you're taking a bit of a gamble. You maybe don't really know what you're doing. So it could be that that's where it originates. It eventually morphed into meaning this modern sense of confusion, but then it was perhaps more about risk. But this notion of hazard, a word that Shakespeare uses a lot, sometimes to mean risk, but sometimes to mean hazard the game. And it comes from an old Arabic word, azar, meaning dice. So actually, this whole notion of risk and hazard that we have in modern days goes back to dice, way before Shakespeare's time. In fact, it's really interesting that a game has led to a word used in a different context.
In Love's Labour's Lost, Act 5, Scene 2, Boyette asks the question, how many inches doth fill up 1 mile? And while that question might seem like an exaggerated question intended for a dramatic purpose, Rob's research points out that when you look at the history of what was going on as Shakespeare was writing that line, people like Queen Elizabeth and an official act of Parliament in 1593 were trying to define the precise distance of the, quote, London mile. Rob, why was Elizabeth I interested in defining the length of a mile? And if there was a London mile, were there also miles for other cities or even other countries?
Yeah, it's odd. We tend to think, well, a mile is a mile. We all know what a mile is, but no one had nailed it down for an international standard. You kind of didn't need international standards. So yes, there was a London mile, a Scottish mile, an Irish mile between different counties. Hampshire and Dorset, next door to each other, had different miles. You can even look at some maps from that era, and the scales have drawn on the same map 3 different scales depending on which mile you're using. So it's utterly bizarre and wonderfully quaint and so on. But some of these miles were like 3 or 4 times longer than another one. So in one part of Europe, a mile might be a bit less than we now call a mile. In other parts, in I think Central Europe, it might be 3 times as long. So what mile are they talking about? No one really cared because no one was measuring it, although the map makers were beginning to care about it more because they needed to communicate with each other. But of course, around late Elizabethan time, that's when England is really beginning to explore the world and to travel. And suddenly, distance becomes important. You need to know what someone means by a yard, a mile, and longer. And I think that must be what drove Elizabeth to say, it's about time we had a standard, and a standard in this country, not least because there were 2 ways of measuring a mile, one based on the furlong. There are 8 furlongs in a mile, which is kind of the length of a furrow of if you're some farming, and the length of a strip might be a furrow long before you have to turn your cattle around or whatever. But another mile or way of getting to it was through yards, which were based on feet, based on inches. And the story goes that an earlier king, one of the Henrys, I think, said, let's change the length of a foot to be the length of my foot, which changed the definition of a foot and everything beyond. So there were 2 ways of getting to a mile, depending whether you used feet or furlongs. And it was about time to standardize it. So that's why in 1593, there was the official act put through Parliament, which Elizabeth initiated, to finally standardize a lot of measures. Not everything was standardized, but miles. That's when we can thank Elizabeth for there being 1760 yards in a mile, which I think in the USA, quite a lot of people know how many feet that is, which is 5,280, or do folks say 5280, 5 tomato? I think I've heard that as a little mnemonic.
I haven't heard 5 tomato, but I'm going to tell my kids that because they'll have a blast with that.
And incidentally, that original Boyer question how many inches doth fill up a mile? Well, I worked it out in the book. So it's 63,360. So now we know. I don't think anyone really wanted the answer, but I worked it out anyway.
That was going to be my next question for you. So was that's the number of inches in a mile? Was that the official London mile in 1593 that they came up with?
Well, it depended whether it was the London inch. I actually don't know, but I think probably there would have been. Yeah, I don't know who established the number 1,760, but that's 8 lots of 220 and so on. So maybe that was already being used as a number, but it's all a bit fuzzy. But anyway, after 1593, when that play's written, everyone knew there was an official mile.
Okay. Many of Shakespeare's plays have scenes that take place in or around the ocean and utilize sailing and ship's navigation in the plot lines. However, when it comes to specific nautical tools like the astrolabe or the cross staff for measuring distance and plotting a course at sea, Shakespeare uses surprisingly few specific nautical terms. Rob, why do you think Shakespeare sometimes uses great detail with other areas of mathematical expertise, but slacks off a little with his nautical math?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to discover which bits of number Shakespeare is very confident with and talks about a lot. So he's particularly detailed about money. He talks about money in pretty much every play and quite often relates to accountancy. And he even talks about interest rates, tax rates, the odds in betting, the Hamlet's bet with Laertes, is that how it's pronounced? That, the odds are specified on what the wager is. So those areas where there's a lot of detail. But the one other mathematical area of sailing, he's as you say, hardly mentions certain things. He never mentions angles or trigonometry or anything to do with geometry. There's no mention of the word triangle. There's no obligation for him. But if he'd done lots of sailing, you'd think he would refer to it because it's so rich in, let us measure the angle of this or whatever. He alludes to it in The Tempest, but doesn't say specifically how it works. So I've got 2 thoughts on why he doesn't mention much in the way of nautical trigonometrical mathematics. First of all, that was university stuff. So as I mentioned earlier, he didn't have university mathematical education, and that's when you would have learnt about geometry and got all of that language. But secondly, maybe this is a sign he just didn't have much experience of sailing. And maybe he never left England. I mean, many people speculate he never left England. Maybe that's why he makes some geographical mistakes. He would have been on boats, but he must certainly have been on boats just across the Thames to get to Southwark from where he lived. So he'd have been on boats many times. He'd have been up and down river. He'd have been to Hampton Court to perform. But you don't need an astrolabe to take you down the Thames. The route is pretty fixed. So all of this, the more sophisticated navigation, perhaps he never saw it. He just heard tales of it, and that's it. So that's my theory, at least.
Even though Shakespeare may leave some detailed nautical terms out of his plays, there's substantial evidence to suggest Shakespeare knew about the latest innovation in nautical travel, and that's the spherical shape of the earth. Rob, how can you tell from Shakespeare's plays that the bard understood the world was a giant ball?
I think there's a popular belief that at that time, a lot of people thought that the earth was flat. But actually, I think the notion of a flat earth had probably been left behind hundreds of years earlier. I think it was pretty common knowledge, and Shakespeare himself would have been surrounded by people, and he himself would have believed that that he lived on a sphere. He might have thought that it was a sphere that was fixed, which the sun went around, but the fact that it was a sphere, I think he would have been happy with anyway. But in any case, in the late 1400s, we see the beginning of the creation of maps on a sphere, a globe. And then in the early mid 1500s, Gerardus Mercator on the continent in modern day Belgium, Netherlands. He might have moved around between Antwerp and Amsterdam, as we call it now. Anyway, Mercator was making fabulous globes, and these were really prized objects. And we know, for example, that John Dee, the mathematician who advised Queen Elizabeth, had a globe. And we don't know anything about Shakespeare's possessions, really. We don't know if he had, a world globe in his lounge, but he had something even better, Because if you think, what was the name of his theatre? His theatre was called the Globe. You know, all the world's a stage. He was kind of embodying the fact that this is the world where we are playing. So he uses the word globe a few times in his plays. I'm not sure he ever uses it explicitly to talk about we live on this globe. Maybe he alludes to that, but it's even more obvious he clearly liked this notion of a globe as the earth, because that's where he and his company performed.
I know we would love to learn more about this topic. What are your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more about math and Shakespeare and how it overlaps? Understanding, of course, that the first place to check out would be Rob's excellent book called Much Ado About Numbers, and we will place a link to that in the show notes for today's episode. But after we have finished reading your book, where should we go to explore even further?
So that's a good question, because I went to so many sources, but I'll pick out three that I found really interesting and insightful. Perhaps the most valuable was an online source, open source Shakespeare, because you can just pick a word and search for it and find where Shakespeare used it. You know, does he ever use the word mathematics? Yes, he does. In one play 3 times. And so that's where you can find so much and explore and investigate like I did. Another quirky book that I found very interesting and helpful was a book called Shakespeare's Money by Bob Behrman. And it just goes into detail about an aspect of numbers that Shakespeare would have been completely immersed in, and it was part of his daily life, how much he was paid, how much his house cost, even suggestions of how he'd have gone about buying a house and borrowing and so on. So it's sort of an insight into everyday life and money, which I think Shakespeare cared about a lot. And then just a quirky different book is the one I mentioned before, Robert Record's Ground of Arts. You can find facsimiles of that online just to see how arithmetic was done in those days, and to see Robert Record trying to be a bit of a fun guy, occasional little rhymes and little dialogues just to try and make doing arithmetic fun, and saying, hey, this is how to do long multiplication. And people are saying, we've never seen this before, but he's saying how exciting it is. So there's 3 places to look at Elizabethan math ideas and the world that they were in.
We will link to all of these resources in the show notes for today's episode, so stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Rob, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, there's so many things to choose from, but I've always liked magic and its connection with maths. And in fact, there's a whole chapter in the book about magic. And I discovered in Shakespeare's time, the first book explaining magic tricks was published. It was called The Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott. It's a delightful book, basically debunking a lot of, they're not witches, they're just doing tricks. That book intrigues me, although the magic isn't very sophisticated. So I think to keep myself stimulated, I'd go for a modern equivalent, which is a book that sits on my shelf behind me and I never have time to read. And it's called Martin Gardner Presents. And it's written by a 20th century, well, he's not really a John Dee, but he was a lover of maths and magic and the connections. And I'd spend my time learning how to do the hundreds of tricks he describes in that book.
Well, I think that sounds like a very fun way and educational, like self-educating. It sounds like a really fun way to spend your time. Definitely useful visit to your deserted island.
I just need someone to do the tricks on. That's
yeah, you'd have to entertain the birds or the fish or something. I don't know. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've kind of got the bug of maths and Shakespeare and the connection. And in general, I've always thought about maths that it's a shame that most people regard it as sitting separate from all the other subjects that we learn. And maybe people make connections between it and science, but no one really makes connections between maths and English literature and history. And so I've got a whole lineup of doing teacher and school talks where I go in and say, right, for once, this isn't a maths talk. This is for your maths and English departments together. We're going to talk about the connections between maths and Shakespeare and literature and history, because all of these things are enriched when you realize that they're connected together. So that will be my project for the next many months, I think.
Well, as a Shakespeare podcast that is focused on history, we are very proud to hear that you are spreading the message that there is an overlap between math, history, literature, and Shakespeare. And it's so much fun to see your book come to life. And we are very excited to have had you visit with us today to share the history of math and what you can explore and know behind these references that we find in Shakespeare's plays. This has been a fun conversation, and I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
We have placed a list of direct links to the resources Rob mentions for you today in the show notes for our episode, including direct links to his book, Much Ado About Numbers. Much Ado About Numbers is available now in the UK, wherever books are sold, and will be released later this year in the US. For our US listeners, I believe you can pre-order a copy of Rob's book on Amazon, or I'd suggest checking with Blackstone's in the UK, as sometimes they will ship UK books for you if you don't want to wait for it to be live in the US. Again, all of these details are available right now at CassidyCash.com/episode 323. That's CassidyCash.com/EP323. While you're on our show notes page, if you'd like a more in-depth look at the history we're talking about today, including copies of Robert Greene's references to Johannes Factotum, primary documents related to the use of Arabic numerals in England, more information on Shakespeare's use of the cipher, and even examples of some of those Mercador maps that Rob mentions today, then use the Become a Patron button to join or log in if you're already a patron of our show, and all of these extras will expand right there on the show notes page. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Patrons of our show get unlimited access to all of our detailed show notes for every episode that we have here at That Shakespeare Life, along with over 150 bonus episodes of our show and special insider extras, including a video library, animated versions of Shakespeare's plays, and a collection of educator resources like hands-on history activity kits that coordinate not only with our show, but of course with Shakespeare's plays. Find out more and explore all of the extras when you sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.